Okay, let's go ahead. Committee will please come to order. We'll go ahead and convene the meeting. And again, I don't need the clerk to take roll because I can count. We have not only a quorum, we have every member of the committee in attendance. So, quorum being present, recognize the vice chair for a motion regarding minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move approval of the previous minutes as written.
Question for the committee is on the motion by the senator from Preston County that we approve our minutes for the meeting held on September 30th. Any discussion? If not, all in favor of the motion, please say aye. Opposed? Ayes have it. Motion's adopted and the minutes are approved. We have, I guess today's agenda we'll say is sort of more of the same, just by way of general announcement. Since we were here last time, which was a week ago, I want to say that a week ago we had probably a dozen, maybe a dozen congressional maps that had been posted to the website. And I don't know that I need to know that exactly, but does that sound right, Bev or Liz? And now we have twice that. It's grown. The list, the posting of maps have grown from 1 dozen to 2 dozen, and I'm told there are more coming. So actually, I think somebody was submitting one today that was maybe we don't have in paper copy. Does everybody have a copy of the packet? It's got about all 2 dozen maps on paper. So, and what we also have, I hope everybody has a copy of this. which is a sheet that shows the population deviation for the two districts on each of those 24 maps. Does everybody have one of those? Okay, starting from the lowest to the highest. So, you know, it's not the chair's intention to report out any map today, but I do want to, I do hope we're going to talk about them. We have received some public comments, although I think some of these maps perhaps have not been up long enough really to generate a whole lot in the way of public comments. But at this point, I think what we'll do with the indulgence of the committee is just open the discussion up. Now, before we do that, I was going to have Liz talk a little bit about compactness. Without objection from anybody in the committee, we'll recognize our counsel to talk to us generally about compactness as a constitutional requirement, and I guess more specifically on ways of measuring compactness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As was discussed at the organizational meeting when I gave my presentation on the constitutional criteria and other possible criteria, compactness is one of the criteria that's specified that's required for congressional districts. Compactness is not defined in our Constitution or in statute. There's not really a single definition, and in fact there are many, I can say many, there's several tests that exist, different formulae that algorithms, mathematical formulae that are employed to generate this relative measure of how compact a district is. There are a few that have been discussed by the courts, and I'll point you to the case of Stone v. Heckler. This was a case decided by the Northern District of West Virginia, Federal Court, District Court, in 1992, looking at congressional district maps. And I point you to this case because it's one of the ones that I think mentions compactness in some of the greatest detail that we have. And it talks about, when the case went to litigation, the expert witnesses for both sides were arguing about which test of compactness should prevail and lend credence to the map that side was putting forth. And the court said that both experts generally agreed that compactness, a relative measure, is difficult to achieve in West Virginia, and they employed different measures of compactness. One that's defined by the court in footnote is the total perimeter test, which measures the total length of district boundaries across an entire congressional districting plan. In the perimeter test, the lower the total perimeter, the more compact the plan. There's also the REOC test, which locates the 2 points on each district's perimeter that are the furthest apart, and then uses the distance between the points as a diameter to construct the smallest circle completely encompassing the district. The ratio of the district's area to the area of the circle is then computed, resulting in a number between 0.00 and 1.00. The nearer the ratio is to 1.00, the more compact the district. The Schwarzberg test calculates the adjusted perimeter by connecting with straight lines those points on a district boundary where 3 or more census units from any district meet. The area of the district is used as an area of a circle whose perimeter is then calculated. The length of the adjusted perimeter is divided by the perimeter of the circle to arrive at a resulting value between 1.00 and infinity. The closer the resulting value is to 1.00, the more compact the district is deemed to be. And this is just to give you a small sampling of the tests that are out there for compactness. Maptitude, the program that we use for generating maps, provides, I think, about a dozen or so, but I believe that there may be more out there that can be utilized. I also note that in this case, the Stone v. Heckler case, the court took judicial notice of the fact that West Virginia does not lend itself by its geography to compactness. The court said, physical characteristics of West Virginia are significant to the determination of compactness issues. To the extent that it was not specifically covered by record evidence, the court takes judicial notice of the state's unique geographical configurations. There are two narrow panhandles. The northern panhandle, consisting of 4 counties, extends between the borders of Ohio and Pennsylvania. The eastern panhandle, consisting of 8 counties and part of a 9th, is bordered by Maryland and Virginia. This is compounded, of course, by the irregular boundaries of counties within the state, which are largely determined by rivers and mountain ranges. Finally, these problems must be reconciled with the West Virginia constitutional requirement that districts be drawn with adherence to county lines. And so the court ultimately did not come to a decision about which measure of compactness is the best measure of compactness, but stated that agreed that the legislature did consider compactness as a principal factor in apportioning congressional districts as it should have. And that is to say that, the various maps that have been proposed and that are before the committee will have varying measures of compactness depending on which tests you're looking at. And there's going to be differences between the 2 districts in terms of how compact they are depending on how they have been drawn.
Liz, thank you for that. Let me ask you a question. What year was Stone v. Heckler?
That was from 1992.
And so was that a challenge to a congressional redistricting plan as opposed to one of the houses of the state legislature? It was.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. This was actually in that case, because of the 1990 census, it reduced West Virginia's congressional delegation from 4 members to 3. So they were dealing with a somewhat analogous situation in that they were shrinking their congressional districts.
That's right. And there were, at the time, we had 4 incumbent congressmen, and in that game of redistricting musical chairs, 3 seats, right? That's okay. So I go over, if you would again, please, the tests that were mentioned. What was the first one that you mentioned? The total perimeter test?
There are only 3 mentioned by the court in this particular court case, and they are mentioned in footnote, but it's the total perimeter test, which measures the total length of district boundaries across the entire congressional districting plan. The lower the total perimeter, the more compact the plan.
Okay.
There's the REOC test.
Wait, stop. Before you go into that one, I was thinking about this, and I'll make sure, see if you agree with my rudimentary understanding of it. But if we're drawing only 2 congressional districts, which is our mandate at this point, the perimeter of the state is a constant in that computation, and really the only variable in terms of that particular test then, if I'm understanding it correctly, would be the length of the line that divides the 2 districts from one another, the interior division line. I'm saying that as a question. Do you agree with that?
Could the chairman please restate?
An easy way to calculate total perimeter would be to just, because the perimeter of the state is constant in all the maps, the only variable is going to be the length of the line that divides the 2 districts.
Well, this is looking at the total length of district boundaries. It does not refer to the perimeter of the, yeah, yes, correct.
Yeah, because the boundaries for every district are going to be the exterior boundaries of the state, divided in some fashion within the state.
I believe that is the case, but I cannot speak to the statistical specifications of these tests beyond what is in the court case.
Okay. Do you know, or do we know, if our mapping software program, Maptitude, allows us to do this computation of total perimeter boundaries?
I would need to check on that. I would need to check and see if that is one of the tests and if they have labeled it as such as the total perimeter test, because I do believe, just in research, sometimes the tests go by alternative names.
Okay. All right. Now go back to your case and tell me, what was the second one? It has someone's name in it.
The REOC test.
REOC. How do you spell REOC?
REOCK. And this test locates the 2 points on each district's perimeter that are the furthest apart, and then uses the distance between the points as a diameter to construct the smallest circle completely encompassing the district. The ratio of the district's area to the area of the circle is then computed. Gives you a number between 0 and 1. The nearer to 1, the more compact the district.
Okay. So, and that's drawn a straight line from farthest point to farthest point.
Correct. And I will also note that the court, in commenting on this case, stated, interestingly, the creator of the REOC test utilized by both experts in this case, has acknowledged that such geographical measure may not be probative in determining compactness in states with unusual boundary configurations. And in footnote, it says, Professor REOC has written, in states such as Oklahoma and Maryland with sparsely populated panhandles, air quotes, some districts must inevitably lack compactness. And that's from a 1961 article about measuring compactness as a requirement of legislative apportionment that's cited in this case.
And that's interesting to me, and I'm not sure that, I mean, I guess I'm kind of getting my mind around the calculation, but is that one of the tests for which our mapping software, Maptitude, can produce a score or a number?
I would need to check. I believe so, but I would need to double check on that.
You know, I mentioned to the distinguished vice chair within the last week that something that's interesting to me is even, I guess, less complicated than that is, and I don't know whether our software can measure that, but it's the very first part of what you described as the REOC test, and it would be just what is the length of a line drawn from the, the farthest 2 points of a district, and for each district, certainly on some of these maps, it appears just from an eyeball test, it would be much farther than on some of the others. But that REOC test, as I understand it, then utilizes that as a component of a more complex calculation. Okay. And then what was the third one that you said? Say that again.
The third one is the Schwarzberg test, which calculates the adjusted perimeter by connecting with straight lines those points on a district boundary where 3 or more census units from any district meet. The area of the district is used as the area of a circle whose perimeter is then calculated. The length of the adjusted perimeter is divided by the perimeter of the circle to arrive at a resulting value between 1.00 and infinity. The closer the resulting value is to 1.00, the more compact the district is deemed to be.
Do you understand that? the distinguished vice chair requests that you read that one more time a little slower.
Certainly.
And if there's anybody in this horseshoe who's going to understand it, it's going to be the vice chair because he's trained as a land surveyor. Maybe the senators, there may be others. The chair is of the opinion that the chair is unlikely to get the full breadth of that. But go ahead, one more time, please.
The Schwarzberg test calculates the adjusted perimeter by connecting with straight lines those points on a district boundary where 3 or more census units from any district meet. The area of the district is used as the area of a circle whose perimeter is then calculated.
Yeah. All right, Vice Chair asks that you halt. Let's Chair recognize the Senator from Preston County.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Liz, would you start with that first sentence again and describe to me or explain to me what you mean by 3 census blocks joining?
So I'm reading directly from the court case. I'm happy to reread it. When it says census units, it does not specify what census units they mean. As we know, there's census blocks, there's tracts, there's block groups, and these sorts of things, but it does not specify what units are used in this calculation. But I can reread it for you a little bit more slowly. The Schwarzberg test calculates the adjusted perimeter by connecting with straight lines those points on a district boundary where 3 or more census units from any district meet. The area of the district is used as the area of a circle whose perimeter is then calculated. The length of the adjusted perimeter is divided by the perimeter of the circle to arrive at a resulting value between 1 and infinity, 1.00 and infinity. The closer the resulting value is to 1.00, the more compact.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure I completely grasped that, but I would love to see an example.
Did you say, Counselor, that in that Stone v. Heckler case, did the court did not endorse any of the 3 or weight any of the 3 more heavily than the other 2?
It did not. The court did mention a preceding United States Supreme Court decision, Karcher. The court said the concept of compactness is elevated to the federal constitutional level by both the majority opinion and Justice Stevens' concurring opinion in Karcher. Although it has not been defined, Justice Stevens, in noting favorably the REOC test, the Schwarzberg test, and the aggregate length test, which in parens the party's perimeter test, recognized compactness as a geographic measure. And then the court goes on to discuss the comments of the creator of the REOC test about how this geographic measure might not be probative in determining compactness in states with unusual boundary configurations. The court also found significant, or took note of, I should say, the methodology of the various experts in arriving at their calculations, and provided that one expert had corrected their calculation for elevation and one had not. So elevation also appears to be something to include in this in these calculations to some extent.
Elevation of what? The earth?
I can read you from the case. We have, of course, the court said, just as we are not called upon to decide competing federal and state requirements of compactness, in our view, any attempt to choose among the redistricting plans for approximations of compactness would not be dispositive of the issue we consider, nor do we think such a mathematical judgment is probative of the state's choice of the goal and compactness as a justification for the population variance resulting from the adoption of Plan 2. We have, of course, reviewed the methodology used by Cooper and Butler in arriving at their calculations. Butler's results appear to be based upon a more rigorous analysis of the data and are therefore better measures of compactness. Butler has calculated his results based on the longitude and latitude of each West Virginia county as supplied by the Bureau of the Census and corrected for elevation. Cooper indicated that his data comes from the West Virginia Blue Book, which in turn was supplied by the West Virginia Geological and Economic Survey. Cooper does not indicate that his data is corrected for elevation.
Is the Cooper referred to in that opinion the infamous Thornton Cooper? Who happens to be with us? Okay. Other questions for our council? Senator from Cabell.
Yeah, I want to run back to that math exercise if I can.
Cooper, in this case, sorry, Senator, Cooper was the state's expert, not the gentleman who is with us today.
The circumference of the circle is the outside perimeters, right?
That is my understanding.
The diameter of the circle is the line you draw across it, right?
That is my understanding, but I would not profess to be an expert in.
The ratio of the circumference to the diameter is always going to be pi, right?
That is something that's stirring in my memories, but
Yeah.
again, I wouldn't.
So that's where you lost me. Were you trying to find the relationship between you were trying to find the ratio of the circumference and the diameter? That's where you lost me. That ratio is always going to be a fixed number. It's always going to be pi, or rounded to pi, right?
I am not sure, Senator. I could not, sitting here today as counsel, I can't tell you how pi
I think we
figures
prepared
in
you
this.
for this. We gave you notice of this test today. Thank you. Well done. That was good.
Senator Archimedes did not give notice of the test. Okay. Other questions of our council? So let's open it up for general discussion of these maps. Again, I'm not thinking that we need to vote on anything today. I'm hoping that maybe by either tomorrow or the end of the week, we're going to be in a position maybe to eliminate some maps. But I don't think we need to do that today. If you look at this table that our council has put together for us, I got to say that of the 24 maps or so, it's really kind of extraordinary to me that all but 2 of them, 20-some of them, 21 or 22, have a deviation number that's under 1%. The bottom 2, and that last one there, which is designated as Trump number 5, has a 10%, a little over 10% deviation. But that one and the one above it are the only ones that have any deviations greater than 1%, which I think actually is pretty extraordinary. And my guess would have been, going into this, that it would not have been possible to do that with maps where you're not going to divide any counties at all. But we got, and who knows, there may be others that we haven't seen yet that have really low deviations and don't divide any counties. But I'm going to throw it open for any senator who seeks recognition, who wants to talk about what he or she may like. I guess we're all he's at this point. He may like or dislike about any of these maps without without formal debate or voting on a motion to, adopt or exclude one. But I think it'd just be useful for food for thought among us and among such of the citizenry who may be tuned into on the live stream of our work and discussion here. Anybody? Chair recognizes the senator from Mercer County.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since nobody else is speaking up, I do have a very limited preference in that if you look at how you can divide the state up, you can either do it in north to south districts or east to west districts, vertical or horizontal. In the past, the districts were more or less north to south. A comment was made last meeting about the southern end of the state shouldn't be connected to either of the panhandles because that would dilute the representation inappropriately and not necessarily fit these compactness calculations. My personal preference is the north to south bifurcation is probably my preference because that would ensure that the southern half of the state, which I represent, would have a high level of representation for whoever their congressperson is. So that's just a generic preference. I went through the maps, and there are about 9 maps that roughly followed the north to south configuration. Beyond that, I don't have a preference, except that perhaps they should be compared according to the compactness calculations that was just discussed to make them more manageable geographically. Also, I want to speak to the comment I made last time I asked the question is should we evaluate where the population growth had been the greatest in the last 10 years since the 2010 census to see whether or not there was a lopsided population growth or reduction in population. Senator from Preston had already calculated that, and after reviewing those numbers, the largest delta was about 5%. Most of the maps, he analyzed all 12 of the maps we looked at last week. The largest delta from growth to the lack of or reduction in population was 5% or less. Most of the calculations were less. So I raised a question just to see what the answer was. To me, the answer is that factor in and of itself is not significant enough to affect which one we choose.
All right. Senator, thank you very much for those comments. Chair recognizes the senator from Cabell County.
Will the senator for Mercer yield?
Yep.
Could we have the Wolfold number 1 map, please, on the screen?
How far in is it? Last one. That's the very last one?
So, Senator, after you've looked at that, and it's on our big screen, but it's also, you have a printed copy in front of you. Do you see that?
Yeah.
So I'm not married to any of these. Like, this is not a rigid map for me. I think it's generally consistent with what you just said you might favor. Am I right? Did I understand that correctly?
That's correct in that context, yes.
Okay, so just as a way of starting the conversation, do you have any, when you look at this, can you suggest some improvements? Because I know improvements are out there that I'm going to be glad to live with if anybody wants to consider this map as we move forward. But just your thoughts, or do you have any thoughts on these particular counties that, for one reason or another, to you might need to be in a different district?
I don't have any specific county that I would prefer to be north or south, so that's not relevant to my perspective.
Thank you.
So I feel like, just sort of quick image, that the compactness of that model might be less compact than some of the others that do more or less the same thing because of if you look at the northern section, it's got a really weird perimeter, if you will. So that's why I suggested that if you accept the north to south preference or theory, as I had discussed, then I think the compactness, like Trump number 5, for example, does almost the same thing, but it looks like it would be better balanced compactness-wise. But that's hypothetical because it's a pretty complicated math that you're doing there. So the tiebreaker to me, or the factor that I would consider a tiebreaker, if whether this one or any of the other 9 that generally did a north to south calculation, that the compactness calculation would be something to look at to make a tiebreaker, decide which one's better than the other. But I certainly don't have an objection to that particular map in the context I just spoke to.
Let me ask you this, Senator. Would you agree with me that however we would define the nebulous term Southern West Virginia, that there is a shared culture somewhat and a shared history somewhat that the southern counties possess that really may not necessarily be congruent with the two panhandles?
I agree with that because that's really part of my thinking in choosing the north to south concept, or recommending it. I'm not trying to lobby too strongly in either direction.
Thank you, Senator.
That was interesting. Liz, do you know, I'm just curious, when we have maps up on the screen there as we're talking about them, are they visible to the people who are streaming our deliberations? Very good. Good. All right. Who else would like to be recognized and talk about any of these maps? I do think it's in my memory, and I can't remember exactly which. I think it might have been at one of our early public hearings in Logan, perhaps. It was when we went to Logan, where one of the speakers who was there made the point that I think maybe the senator from Mercer and the senator from Cabell were just talking about. And I don't remember the gentleman's name, but I do remember him saying that he wanted for us to remember that they are people of the South. Does anybody else have that memory? Was at that hearing, and wanted to be kept with southern counties.
Yes.
You remember it? It's not a figment of my imagination.
No, that happened.
All right, now we've got, when we were here a week ago, we did have a discussion from one or a couple senators about trying to keep Kanawha and Putnam and Cabell counties together in recognition of the contention that it sort of operates as an economic and cultural unit. Maybe not a complete metropolitan statistical area, but a unit nonetheless. And I note a number of the maps that we've got before us do that. And I think actually the senator from the 8th added a map between the last meeting and this meeting. Which one is that? Okay. Yep. Jeffries 3. All right. And I see that has those 3 counties added together, included it together as part of a map. Senator from the 8th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I know this is trying to come up with a perfect map is, I just don't see where we're going to be able to accomplish that, but I think every one of the maps in here have merit to it. My favorability and prefer is still a east and west map separating the two powerhouses, I call them powerhouses, between the Monongalia area and the eastern panhandle. I did, map number 3 is the senator from Putnam made a good point, and the senator from Cabell about keeping Cabell, Putnam, and Kanawha together, and I agree, was not thinking about that, and that it was the reason for coming up with map number 3. I also seen a couple other maps there too that I thought were good maps. Trump number 15 was interesting, and I drew a couple other maps from that to separate the Monongalia and the Berkeley Jefferson area again. So my preference is still going to be the east-west, but like I say, Mr. Chairman, I think it's going to be difficult, whatever decision we do come up with. It's a shame that we're down to 2. 3 would make it 3 congressional, would make things a whole lot simpler and better. But, you know, that's the situation we're in right now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
To the senator from the 8th, thank you. And it's clear to me you've spent a bunch of time and applied some energy and brain power trying to, you know, craft maps. A lot of people have. And I think it's really important. And I'm hoping that we're going to make the best decision, whatever it is. I agree with you 100%. I think we'd all rather be in a position other than having to go from 3 to 2 Congress persons in West Virginia. It's most unfortunate. But that said, that's a duty we have, and we're not going to escape it. And it's incumbent upon us, I guess, to craft a map and ultimately adopt a map that makes the most sense for the most people of West Virginia. And I appreciate the great effort you've made already. Senator from the 4th seeks recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I definitely agree. I'd rather be drawing 4 congressional districts rather than 2 congressional districts for sure, to improve that map. But I had a question for council.
Counselor?
Liz, is there, relative to growth areas, I think we've heard discussion a lot about areas that may grow, or when we're talking about powerhouse areas, when we're talking about the panhandles. If there's not one, Senator Swope had said that, Senator from Mercer, that the variance in growth was pretty small from the north to south, and do you know if there's any variance in the east to west? Has anybody brought that to you?
I do not have that information, no, Senator.
Okay. Are there, when we're considering growth areas, is there anything in case history that tells us that we should be looking at future growth, or do we look at the current population?
So what the Constitution requires is that the so-called one man, one vote principle is looking at the population as it has been calculated in the most recent census. And so that is what is constitutionally required to dictate getting to as close to equal population as possible, as close to 0% as possible. It's not necessarily, it's not looking at speculation as to areas of growth in that regard.
Okay, thank you.
Senator from Preston seeks recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also have a question for council, and it's maybe a bit of a bonehead question, but let's take, for example, Trump number 5 map, which is decidedly pretty wide in its deviation at 10.37%. Now, I see that District 1 is 10.37% heavy, yet District 2 is 10.37% light. Yet the deviation is 10.37. So my question is, in the eyes of the court, do they consider the deviation from the perfect population to the furthest extreme, or from the least to the most? So would that actually be a deviation of 20.5% in the court's eyes?
The way that courts have let me see if I can find something to quote from here. What a number of courts have looked at is looking at the highest, the greatest deviation district and the lowest deviation district. We have a little bit of a unique situation here because we only have 2 districts that we're drawing, so they're going to be inverses of one another no matter which way you draw the districts. So that's why you see the positive 10.37 and the negative 10.37, and the percent deviation appears representing the absolute that is not with regard to the positive or negative.
For a congressional map to be drawn, you may have said this before, and I'm just trying to remind myself, what is the largest deviation that the court would consider to be acceptable?
There is not one for congressional. There is not. This is where the congressional and the senatorial really diverge, in that congressional, it needs to be, let me give you a quote here. There needs to be a good faith effort to achieve absolute equality. As nearly as is practicable, one man's vote in a congressional election is to be worth as much as another's. And that is the dictate from Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. And those quotes come from Westbury versus Sanders, which is a 1964 case, and the Karcher v. Daggett case from 1983, and the Kirkpatrick v. Pressler case from 1969, which are kind of the big 3, some of the biggest cases in this area.
Okay. All right, well, that makes sense. Is there any consideration in the eyes of the court for areas of growth and areas of loss, historical areas of growth and historical areas of loss? Because if you recall from the last meeting, one of my points of contention was that the growth areas of the state should be separated so that both districts would grow at the same rate or close to the same rate. And I actually analyzed that for each of the maps just to get a feel for in which instances going forward should the growth remain similar to the past 10 years, which ones would grow and which ones would shrink, or in another instance, which would grow faster than the other.
I could tell you that in sort of the infamous quote about what the court has said, this is from Karcher v. Daggett, any number of consistently applied legislative policies might justify some variance, including, for instance, making districts compact, respecting municipal boundaries, preserving the cores of prior districts, and avoiding contests between incumbent representatives. Those are some of the that the court said, as long as the criteria are non-discriminatory, these are all legitimate objectives that on a proper showing could justify minor population deviations. And those are what the court has supplied as potential legitimate considerations, again, if applied in a consistent manner. The court has not, the court has not specified growth areas in that statement, but I'd be happy to look into that.
Okay. And just one more question, then I'll leave you alone. Is there, in the case of redistricting, any sort of rules of construction? And what I mean by that, in boundary surveying, we have rules of construction when you have conflicting information. Maybe one bit of information is more important than another, so it would take precedence. What is the most important, or maybe is there a ranking of what is most important? Obviously, contiguous is absolutely paramount. If we don't have a contiguous district, if it's broken, that would not be legitimate. But what would the next would be? Compactness, would it be population, or do we know?
There are, I believe, some states that rank criteria in that fashion. Our state does not in its constitution, and in general, this might not be exactly what you're asking, but the U.S. constitutional requirements are paramount. West Virginia constitutional requirements fall beneath that, and then there are, and of course there's federal law, and then there's any other criteria that are placed in statute. but the constitutional requirements are at the top. That's not a rule of construction, but that is the sort of the paramount consideration. Beyond that, if you're asking about how to rank the criteria, that tends to be more of a battle of the experts at a later point.
I see. So in your review of the case law, then there wasn't any sort of direction given by the courts as to what would be most important and less important and that sort of thing?
In the case of Stone v. Heckler, what the court came down to on compactness was it has to be given, again, because it's not ranked, it has to be given top consideration, not top consideration as in the first consideration, but it has to be given, let me see how they put it. The court stated in talking about Karcher, first, the Supreme Court emphasized the good faith effort required to satisfy the first prong of the constitutional standard was a good faith effort to reduce the population differences to zero. It also said, quoting another case, we have required that absolute population equality be the paramount objective of apportionment in the case of constitutional districts. And, you know, in looking at compactness, the court said, we think it has been adequately demonstrated that each legislative body kept the concept of compactness as a principal goal of its redistricting efforts and did this primarily in pursuit of fulfilling its state constitutional obligations. And ultimately, the fact that there were other plans that would have been deemed more compact under that Plan 3 under the 3 tests employed by the experts does not detract from the legislature's effort.
Did I understand you to say that the population equality is paramount and that compactness is just a goal?
Again, it's not stated that way in the Constitution, but that is the Constitution. That is how the court has interpreted the constitutional requirement of equality of population versus compactness.
I see. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Liz, what case was that from which you were reading there?
This is once again Stone v. Heckler from 1992.
So 1992. And so is it fair to say that, and I wasn't in the legislature when this happened, but when the West Virginia legislature drew the congressional districts 10 years ago, and there were 3 going in and 3 coming out, but my memory is that the population in what was the 2nd congressional district then had grown and the others had lost. And maybe Senator from Preston was in the legislature at the time, maybe Senator from Marion was in the legislature at the time, but the legislature solved it, I think, by just moving Mason County, right, from the 2nd congressional district to the 3rd. I think that was the plan that was adopted for the congressional districts 10 years ago. And the court challenge to that case, which was brought, I think, by the County Commission of Jefferson County, challenged it on the grounds that it created 3 districts which were not exactly equal in population. In other words, there was some belief then, I think, that the jurisprudence at that point required absolute equality. You had to get it to one person plus or minus one person. And you can't do that unless you're willing to divide counties. And my recollection, Liz, you tell me if I'm wrong, in that Jefferson County Commission and Tenant case from 10 years ago, the court panel that was impaneled to evaluate the plan ruled that it was unconstitutional because it didn't meet that exact equality standard, but on appeal, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed it and basically said, I think in recognition of the fact that we have this state constitutional requirement where we're not to divide counties, that we were really, really close, and the legislature was really, really close, and they approved the plan, even though it was not exactly equal.
That's correct, and I can read you just a brief excerpt from this case. The court, the state conceded in that case, and the court recognized the state's concession that it could have achieved smaller population variations. Then the remaining question for the court then was whether the state could demonstrate the population deviations in its plan were necessary to achieve some legitimate state objective. And the court held that none of the alternative plans came close to vindicating all three of the state's legitimate objectives while achieving a lower variance. The court stated that here, given the small size of the deviations as balanced against the importance of the state's interests, the consistency with which the plan as a whole reflects those interests, and the lack of available alternatives that might substantially vindicate those interests yet approximate population equality more closely, the plan that was adopted is justified by the state's legitimate objectives.
And so what they were referring to as legitimate objectives were what, compactness and the desire not to divide, or the objective not to divide counties.
Yes, the court noted that state legislators expressed concern that the plan contravened the state's longstanding rule against splitting counties, placed two incumbents' residences in the same district, and moved 1/3 of the state's population from one district to another. And Senate Bill 1008, codified at West Virginia Code 1-2-3, does not split county lines, redistrict incumbents into the state district, or require dramatic shifts in the population of the current districts.
Okay. Thank you, Liz. Senator from Marion's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to weigh in a little bit on, I don't really have a preferred map at this time, but I think regardless of how this map is drawn, it's not going to be a perfect map. If we do north and south, I don't think the folks in Martinsburg is going to have much in common with the folks up in Hancock County. And if we, we do east and west, I don't think folks in Martinsburg may have much in common with the folks in McDowell County, but we have to come up with something. And the reason, Mr. Chairman, that I like the east-west scenario, and I'm not sure where the lines need to be exactly yet, or where I think they should be, because I think we can come up with a quality of population, and I think we can justify compactness. But what I like about it the best, and I'll use the word vibrant and maybe not so vibrant, I think you're going to have a congressperson that represents a vibrant part of the state versus a non-vibrant part of the state in each of those districts. And I think it will be the duty of that congressperson to make that congressional district grow and be the best that it can be. That's why I'm leaning that way right now. I just think that is something that should be considered. I know it's not maybe in the law, Liz, to consider that type of scenario, but as a representative, just in our Senate districts or if we served in the House, we don't want one part of our district to be less prosperous than the other, and we do all we can to try to help the entire district. So for those reasons, Mr. Chairman, that's why I lean more toward an east-west scenario. Thank you for hearing me out. I appreciate it.
To Senator from Marion, thank you. Senator from Campbell seeks recognition.
So, Council, I would like you to follow up on the Senator from Preston's request. I know historically that we go back to disputes between Hamilton and Jefferson on how to do congressional reapportionment. And there's been litigation, I think, starting in the 1820s. Every cycle there's been litigation over reapportionment. I do believe that we're looking at a snapshot in time that occurred on during a certain period during 2020 and identified how many people we have in our state or had that day or that month or that year. So I guess my question to you is, find a case, if you can, that says we're allowed to look into the future with a crystal ball no matter how advanced we are technologically, and tell what's going to happen in terms of growth in the population or population shifts or deaths and births. I think if you get into that as a stated criteria and we get into litigation over this map, I guarantee there's going to be litigation over the House map. I don't think there'll be litigation over ours. But if there would be, that to me, and I want, if you can answer it, answer it. But to me, if we're trying to look into the future and make decisions based on what that might be, have you seen any cases in your research that shows that that's ever been upheld as a legit reason to engage in reapportionment of a congressional district?
I need to look into that a little bit further to answer your question definitively, but again, I would just say that what the constitutional criteria is looking at absolute population equality here and now.
Okay, and the last point I'll try to make is that, so my district is the westernmost county. It's Virginia Point, which overlooks Kentucky and Ohio. And under my esteemed senator's map from Putnam, Senator Jeffries, those folks, number 3.
Number 3, maybe we could put that on the screen.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So if you look at that map, which has been advocated for, that puts us, my people, me, in with the easternmost tips of the state. And I'm asking you a question again based on your research. Isn't it true that there are in fact considerations given in the court decisions that say it's favorable to have people geographically closer to their representative, and the representative geographically and correspondingly closer to the constituent?
I think that those are policy arguments that have been advanced and represented in court cases in that way.
Okay, you haven't really seen any court decision that use that as a factor?
It is not at my fingertips.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you very much.
But I would say, I think in following up on that salient point, and I won't pretend that I understand all the formulae, but I think that what you just said, what Senator from Cabell just said, is embraced at some level in the concept of compactness, of having people be closer together and closer to whoever it is who's elected to represent them geographically. In my limited and rudimentary understanding of compactness. Senator from Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Council, to expand maybe on the line of questioning that Senator from Cabell had, looking into the future with the crystal ball, I recognize that the Constitution requires that at least every 10 years there's a reapportionment of districts in order to keep the population more equal. Is there any time when a reapportionment has or could take place prior to the 10-year period? Let's say, for instance, that we have a map which is perfect today, and in 5 years we see that there's a large growth area in some portion of our state. Is it unprecedented for the state to come in and redivide the district sometime before the next decade? And would that be prohibited? Is there anything to stop us from doing that? Prohibited. That would be my answer then. Are you going to embarrass me now?
I'm not aware of this. That's an interesting question, but I'm not aware. I'm familiar with the constitutional requirement that this occur every 10 years, but I would need to look more closely into that.
I would not expect you to answer it on the spot, but I would be curious to learn if there was anything which would prohibit that from occurring on the congressional level. And maybe there's an answer for that. I see the chairman is digging into a law book, so he probably has an answer for us. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will yield to your research.
All right, let's see if I can. I don't know, I'm going to look for congressional districts in a minute, but Article 6, Section 10 of our Constitution, at least as to state Senate districts, says the arrangement of senatorial and delegate districts and apportionment of delegates shall hereafter be declared by law as soon as possible after each succeeding census taken by authority of the United States. When so declared, they shall apply to the first general election for members of the legislature to be thereafter held and continue in force unchanged until such districts shall be altered and delegates apportioned under the succeeding census. So at least for state legislative districts, I read the Constitution as saying once you enact them, they stay for 10 years. I know, like you, I've watched on national news where, other states, I'm thinking it was Texas maybe, in the middle of the decade, had a big political fight and they were redrawing their districts. I don't think that I would defer to council on that and see if there's anything similar to that applies to the congressional districts. But, Counselor, do you read that the same way I do, that language that says, and shall continue in force unchanged until such districts shall be altered and delegates apportioned under the succeeding census?
This is from Section 10.
Yeah, it's Article 6, Section 10 of the Constitution.
Yes, I saw that.
Do you agree? Do you think that means that future legislatures in 2024, 2026 are precluded from redrawing these maps unless there's been an intervening census of the United States? I see Thornton Cooper behind you is nodding his head. He seems to agree, but I don't know if it's ever been tested. What do you think, Liz?
I can't think of an instance where it has been tested. I know that there are states where there are some other states that, in adopting their criteria and their procedures, revisit, I believe, the maps more frequently, but this is, I'm really stretching there. It's sort of an esoteric question. I have to look into it a little bit more before I answer.
So I do know this, though, and this is when I was going through the old blue books, and I think I sent everybody out those emails of the way the state Senate districts, the maps of how they were configured throughout the 20th century, and there were some big gaps in years where there was no new apportionment or redistricting of Senate districts after a census. And there was one in 1951, and then the next one didn't occur until 1964. And I think that stayed in place until 1977. And so that is inconsistent with this, at least in my reading of it, but okay. What else? Who else has a question for council or wants to weigh in on the subject of a particular map or maps generally? I'll just pose the question, is there anybody who's a member of the committee who thinks he wants to submit yet another map that we haven't had a chance to look at yet, or you have anybody working on one that they would like to have the committee consider? And I was told today, and I forget who told me, but that there was at least one other person that was wanting to submit a map. Senator from the 4th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had intention, I don't know if that's one of the things that you had to potentially submit another map, but I believe that map's already in here, so I was just going to have something out there to create discussion, but it's already in there and we've discussed it, so thank you.
Okay. And Liz, You have another one that's, so we have more that are coming. Well, and that's fine. I don't, it was not the chair's intention to try to force anything out today. I'm thinking maybe tomorrow or Friday, we can eliminate one or two of them, and including the two that have Trump on them as the author, just because of their extraordinary population deviations there at the bottom. But Liz, to the senators from Preston's point, I think when we talk about deviation, I think his question was, do you add the plus and minus together by absolute value? And that's really the deviation you're talking about. In other words, like Trump 14 there is really not a 0.2% deviation. It's a 0.4% deviation from the highest to the lowest. And Jeffries, say Jeffries 2 would be a 0.12 total deviation. Is that the way that in what you've read in the cases, is that the way that they calculate or refer to the deviation? It's the absolute value from the highest to the lowest?
There are obviously a lot of measures that there are a lot of different calculations that can be made, but in the Tennant v. Jefferson County Commission case, for instance, the court noted that Senate Bill 1008, which was ultimately codified, its chief selling point was that it required very little change to the existing districts. It moved just one count. This was the smallest shift of any plan considered by the legislature. Senate Bill 1008, however, has a population variance of 0.79%. And so sometimes the courts note the number of people different between the ideal population and the districts. In that case, of course, there were 3 districts that are being considered, so it wasn't just looking at, in that case, there were 3 districts that were being considered, and so I think, they looked at what was the highest variance district.
Highest variance from the mean, or highest variance, or the variance from the highest number of people to the lowest number of people?
The court doesn't, the court does not always spell out how it is calculating the terms that it is using. That might be something that tends to be explained by an expert, but what we have is the ideal, for instance, on this slide, the ideal population, which is the population of the state divided by the total number of districts that we're going to have, and that gives you the ideal population. And the deviation here in each instance represents the deviation of each district from that ideal population in a percentage.
Okay, thank you. Senator from the 8th.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Liz, I've heard you 2 times mention the population equality. What can you define that for me? What all that entails?
So let me read you the immortal language of Westbury versus Sanders. This is quoted in Karcher v. Daggett. These are U.S. Supreme Court decisions. When it comes to congressional districts, this is deriving from Article 1, Section 2. Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution establishes a high standard of justice and common sense for the apportionment of congressional districts, equal representation for equal numbers of people. Precise mathematical equality, however, may be impossible to achieve in an imperfect world. Therefore, the equal representation standard is enforced only to the extent of requiring that districts be apportioned to achieve population equality as nearly as is practicable. As we explained further in Kirkpatrick v. Pressler, the as nearly as practicable standard requires that the state make a good faith effort to achieve precise mathematical equality. Unless population variances among congressional districts are shown to have resulted despite such effort, the state must justify each variance no matter how small. Article 1, Section 2, therefore, permits only the limited population variances which are unavoidable despite a good faith effort to achieve absolute equality or for which justification is shown. That's the language that the court uses to describe essentially that the concept that equal population would be where you have the ideal population here, with each district being 8,096, 858 people.
So it's not necessarily describing basically the quality of life for each.
No.
Okay.
It is number of people.
Just okay. It's based on population driven then.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator from Preston County.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Circling back on your statement earlier about eliminating some maps, I might bring to the attention of the committee that Trump number 16 and Woeful number 1 are identical. So I would probably, I would probably suggest that we eliminate Trump number 16.
If they're identical, yeah, okay. We'll call it a motion. Senator from Preston moves we eliminate Trump 16. On your say-so that it's identical to the map by the senator from Campbell.
It is.
All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. Here's the language from our state constitution relating to representatives to Congress. It's in Article 2, Section 4. And all the things that we've been talking about that are required by the federal Constitution are also required by the West Virginia Constitution. Here's what it says. For the election of representatives to Congress, the state shall be divided into districts corresponding in number with the representatives to which it may be entitled. And we know that's 2. Which districts shall be formed of contiguous counties and be compact. Each district shall contain as nearly as may be an equal number of population to be determined according to the rule prescribed in the Constitution of the United States. So equal population, contiguous territory, compact, and counties. All right. Anything else? Any other discussion? This is such fun, and I'm sure of such interest to our listeners and viewers. We can go farther. Apparently, we've got at least a couple more congressional maps coming to look at. I think there are today there are up now some Senate district maps that have been posted, with more to be posted. I will make this announcement that any member of this committee who wants to post a map of Senate districts, probably not too early to do it, and we'll have, as with the congressional maps, I think we want to have them up long enough for the public to get a chance to look at them and throw rocks at them or say they really like them or what. Senator from the 8th.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And maybe this was answered in our very first meeting, but the House maps that are up, are we to consider those, or how's that to work?
Well, there's a long tradition, and here, that the House of Delegates takes the first pass at a map of new House districts and the Senate takes the first pass at maps of new Senate districts. Senator's point's well taken. These are like any other bills. They have to be passed by both houses of the legislature. A bill drawing House districts, a bill drawing Senate districts, a bill creating the 2 congressional districts. Bill has to pass in identical form of both houses and be signed into law by the governor or become law without the governor's signature. So I would say, in my thinking, it's premature for us to spend any time. I know the House of Delegates has posted, I think on the redistricting website, at least one, maybe there's more than one up there now, House maps of House of Delegates districts. But it's premature for us to spend any time working on them. I mean, I think it's entirely appropriate to look at them and maybe even communicate with members of the House if you have, if somebody has questions or reservations or, comments that might be helpful. But I don't think we'll do any formal work in the Senate, either in this committee or in the whole of the Senate, on House of Delegates maps until such time as we actually receive a bill from the House of Delegates that they've passed that draws, the delegate districts as they have chosen to configure them. Senator from the 8th.
Mr. Chairman, I was speaking of the congressional maps.
Oh, okay. Actually, among some of the maps that are posted on the Senate are a couple that we lifted from the House of Delegates website and posted. I think they're posted under my name. So among those Trump whatever 1 through 16, you'll see a couple maps that they're maps. Apparently, they're not only identical to the map by the senator from Campbell, but identical to some House maps. And I sort of felt like, let's look at as many as we can together here, and we don't have any standing rule or tradition that we can't look at all the available congressional maps as we move forward in that process. I'm sorry, I misunderstood the question. Okay, anything else for the good of the order? I think the plan is going to be to meet again tomorrow at 3 p.m. Am I right on that, Liz?
Room?
You have a different suggestion?
I do not.
You're suggesting that we should announce where a future meeting will be. All right. So we'll consider it to be announced that the next meeting of this committee will be tomorrow, Thursday, at 3 o'clock p.m. in this room, the Senate Judiciary Committee room. Anything else for the good of the order? Chair observes the senator from Logan's been quiet today. All right. Well, Chair recognizes the senator from Preston County.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move we adjourn until the next scheduled meeting.
All right. Questions on adjournment? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it.